The oppressive humidity clung to me like a shroud, even inside the medical examiner's office during a power outage. The air conditioning had sputtered into silence hours ago, leaving the building to stew in its own stale heat. A single battery-powered lantern, perched precariously on a stack of evidence boxes, cast a sickly yellow glow over the stainless steel examination table. The hum of a distant generator was the only constant sound, a low thrumming pulse beneath the uneasy quiet. "I wanted to see this, Seth," the detective said, his voice a low rumble in the dim space. He didn't wait for my confirmation, simply gestured towards the table. He was a man of few words, which suited me fine. We often communicated in shorthand, a mutual understanding forged in the crucible of grim discoveries. I stepped closer, my gaze sweeping over the scene. On the table, beneath a thin sheet of plastic, lay a collection of bones. Not a full skeleton, not even close. These were fragments meticulously cleaned, arranged with an unsettling precision. A femur cleanly sectioned midshaft, a tibia similarly severed, and then the unnerving part, a cluster of phalanges, laid out like a tiny, macabre fan, each bone aligned with its neighbor as if still articulating in life. Initial recovery from Sector Gamma, the detective continued, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, momentarily blinding me before settling on the table. Remote patch of wilderness, not much else yet. Animals have been at it naturally, but these were different. I nodded slowly, already leaning in. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate dance of excavation and articulation, itched to touch. My eyes were already tracing the cut marks. The bone ends were smooth, almost polished. This wasn't a hack job with a blunt instrument. This was surgical. "The way they were found," he replied, his tone heavy. "Scattered, yeah, but almost displayed, like someone wanted us to find them, but not too easily." I picked up the femur, turning it under the lantern's weak light. The cross-section was clean, remarkably so. No splintering, no jagged edges indicative of a struggle or a frantic attempt to conceal. This was a deliberate act. The perpetrator knew anatomy, knew how bone behaved under pressure, knew precisely where to apply force for a clean break. A saw, certainly, a very fine-toothed saw, perhaps even a bone saw. "The scatter pattern," I murmured, more to myself than to the detective. How wide an area, a few square miles, dense forest, deep ravines, were still mapping it. These pieces were found near a natural clearing, almost like an offering. An offering. The word resonated unpleasantly. I moved to the phalanges, gently nudging one with the tip of my gloved finger. They were small, delicate bones, yet they too bore the mark of deliberate severance, though the breaks here were less precise, perhaps due to the smaller size of the bone or a different tool. It seemed inconsistent. Why such precision on the larger bones and a slightly rougher touch on the smaller ones? Or was it a different tool for a different purpose? My mind began to reconstruct the scene, even without having been there. The vastness of the wilderness, the careful placement, the surgical dismemberment. No soft tissue attached, I asked, my gaze still fixed on the bones. None on these, scavenged clean or cleaned. The pause in his voice was telling. Clean, that meant intent, the victim's identity. No leads yet, no dental records, no immediate missing persons match for the area. We're running DNA, but that'll take time, especially with the power issues. I could feel the familiar knot tightening in my stomach. This wasn't just a disposal. This was a statement. The precision, the arrangement, the sheer audacity of leaving such a carefully curated collection of remains. It wasn't about hiding the body. It was about presenting it. My eyes fell on a small, almost imperceptible groove on the surface of the tibia, not a cut mark, but a faint, linear abrasion. I leaned closer, pulling a small magnifying glass from my pocket. Under the magnification, it looked like a shallow, almost decorative scoring. It wasn't accidental, it was too deliberate, too symmetrical. "This," I said, pointing it out to the detective with the flashlight beam. "This isn't from an animal, and it's not from the dismemberment process. It's superficial." The detective squinted, a tool mark, perhaps, or something else. I paused, turning the bone slowly. The scoring seemed to follow a very specific, almost artistic curve. It wasn't random. It was a detail that suddenly made the whole picture sharper and infinitely more disturbing. The surgical precision, the deliberate scattering, and now this, a subtle, almost artistic flourish. This wasn't a killer driven by passion or desperation. This was someone with a plan, someone who saw the human body not just as a vessel to be destroyed, but as a canvas. "Wait," I mumbled, turning the femur again. I remembered the clean cut, the polished edges, but there was something else. A microscopic irregularity, a faint, almost invisible scratch running perpendicular to the main cut on one side. It was so minute, so easily missed. It looked like a slip, a momentary loss of control with the saw. But if the killer was so precise, so meticulous, why this one imperfection? It didn't add up. It felt out of place. Had I misjudged the precision? Was it less perfect than I initially believed? Or was this a deliberate misdirection? The thought gnawed at me. "I need to go to that site," I declared, pushing away from the table. The image of those scattered, meticulously arranged bones, coupled with that unsettling scoring, had cemented a terrible certainty in my mind. This wasn't just a body. This was a message. And I had a feeling this killer was just getting started. The bone felt cool and unnervingly light in my gloved hand. The scoring, those precise, almost deliberate grooves, continued to nag at me. It wasn't the ragged work of a hacksaw or the blunt force of an axe. This was different. This spoke of intent, of a careful hand guided by something more than just a desire to destroy. It spoke of knowledge. The drive back from the site was a blur of flashing lights and hushed voices. The lead detective, a man whose face was etched with too many late nights, had given me a grim nod as the evidence bags were carefully loaded. He knew, as I did, that this wasn't going to be a simple case. The sheer scope of the scattered remains, the methodical nature of their placement, felt like a deliberate challenge. Back in the city, the air grew heavy, pregnant with an impending storm. By the time the evidence crates were wheeled into the medical examiner's office during a power outage, the sky had finally ruptured. The lights flickered once, twice, then died with a soft groan from the ventilation system. A collective sigh rippled through the few night staff, quickly followed by the click of emergency lanterns and the glow of phone screens. "Just what we needed," the lead detective muttered, his voice a low rumble in the sudden oppressive quiet. He was a broad-shouldered man, his uniform perpetually rumpled, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He held a large, clunky flashlight, its beam carving a shifting tunnel through the gloom. "Can I still work, Seth?" I nodded, already pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. "It'll be slower, but yes. The main objective right now is reconstruction and identification. We need to know who this person was." The air was thick, humid, and smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain. The emergency lights, yellow and weak, cast long, dancing shadows, turning familiar equipment into monstrous silhouettes. It was hardly ideal, but the work couldn't wait. Each moment was a lost opportunity to find the answers we needed. My colleague, a younger forensic technician with an almost unsettling calm, set up a portable lantern on the main examination table. Its harsh, white light pooled over a large, stainless steel surface, illuminating the first of the evidence bags. "We've got the preliminary inventory," the technician said, handing me a clipboard. "Roughly 60% of a skeleton, mostly long bones and skull fragments. No soft tissue to speak of, just some desiccated remnants." I scanned the list, my gaze drawn to the carefully labeled bags. 60%, that's surprisingly high for such a wide scattering. Usually, if a killer wanted to obscure identity, they'd ensure much less remained. This felt different, almost like a presentation. "That's what we thought too," the technician agreed, adjusting the lantern. The crime scene unit spent hours sifting, like they wanted us to find some of it, just not all. I carefully opened the first bag, revealing a segment of a femur. The bone was clean, almost bleached, stripped of any lingering tissue. My fingers traced the edges, feeling the familiar texture, but also something else, a subtle smoothness where there should have been a rough break. "The cuts," I murmured, more to myself than to them. They're incredibly clean, like surgical. The lead detective grunted, leaning closer, flashlight beam joining the lantern's glow. I said that at the sight. What does it mean? It means whoever did this knew what they were doing, I explained, picking up a smaller bone, a humorous fragment. Look at this. No hesitation marks, no splintering from blunt force. The cuts are precise, following anatomical lines, almost as if they were dissecting, not just dismembering. I turned the fragment, exposing a perfectly smooth, angled surface. And the angle, it's consistent across multiple fragments. It suggests a very specific type of blade, handled by someone with a deep understanding of human anatomy. My initial thought that the killer was simply efficient began to curdle into something more unsettling. This wasn't just efficiency, it was mastery. I spent the next hour meticulously laying out the retrieved fragments on the sterile table. The power outage, while frustrating, forced a certain focus. The lack of ambient noise, the stark, isolated pool of light made every observation sharper. I worked slowly, methodically, like assembling a complex puzzle without the picture on the box. Femur, tibia, fibula, fragments of ribs, vertebrae. Each piece told a silent story. As I pieced together a section of the vertebral column, aligning the smooth, almost polished cuts, a small detail caught my eye. I leaned in, adjusting the lantern, and picked up a magnifying glass. Under magnification, the discoloration resolved into a series of minute, almost invisible striations. These weren't from the dismemberment. These were older, healed, and embedded in the bone itself. A healed fracture, perhaps. No, too uniform. Look at this, I called to the technician, pushing the vertebra closer to the light. These striations, they're too regular for a natural injury or wear, and the pattern, it's almost like a very fine etching. The technician peered through the magnifier. Almost looks like a branding or something similar but microscopic. I shook my head slowly. Not branding, something embedded, almost like a foreign material that's been absorbed into the bone over time. My mind raced, sifting through obscure forensic texts, rare medical anomalies. This wasn't typical. This wasn't something I'd find in just anyone. Then, as my eye followed the faint lines, I saw it. A minuscule, almost imperceptible symbol, formed by the convergence of the striations. It was abstract, geometric, barely visible, but undeniably there. It wasn't a letter or a number, but a stylized mark like a signature. Another one even fainter. The detective knelt, his flashlight beam steady. What is it, Seth? Some kind of medical implant? Not that I've ever seen, I admitted, a knot tightening in my stomach. It's too small, too integrated. And the symbol, it's not standard. This isn't a run-of-the-mill victim. This person had something unique in their skeletal structure. Could this be a clue to the victim's identity, or something far more sinister? There was this mark on the victim, or was it a mark left by the killer, a twisted signature integrated into the very fabric of the remains? The surgical precision, the deliberate scattering, and now this arcane symbol. It was all too much. I felt a flicker of doubt. There was I seeing patterns where none existed. There was the exhaustion and the eerie lighting making me connect dots that weren't there. But the symbol was real, undeniable, even if its meaning remained shrouded. The killer didn't just dismember a body. They crafted a message. The medical examiner's office during a power outage felt like a tomb. The hum of the emergency generator was a low, thrumming heartbeat beneath the floor, a stark contrast to the usual fluorescent buzz. Its sporadic flickering light cast long, dancing shadows across the sterile surfaces, making the already stark room feel cavernous and full of unseen movement. The air, usually climate-controlled to an almost aggressive chill, had a new, colder edge now, a dampness that seeped into my clothes and settled in my bones. I ignored it, my gaze fixed on the array of plastic evidence bags. Each contained a piece of what was once a person, now meticulously separated and laid out on the stainless steel table. The scent of disinfectant and something metallic, something that always clung to these places, was amplified by the lack of ventilation, thick and cloying. My mind replayed the image of the specific, almost surgical, pattern of bone remodeling I'd found near the shoulder joint. A healed fracture, yes, but one that had been set with an unusual, precise method. It wasn't a common break, nor a common repair. It was a signature I felt, but whose? The victim's or the killer's twisted commentary on the victim's past. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the snap echoing in the quiet room. The lead detective, a man whose patience I often tested, had left hours ago, grumbling about the lack of progress in the generator's drone. He'd suggested I pack it in, come back in the morning when the power was hopefully restored, but I couldn't. Not with that mark gnawing at me. Under the harsh, focused beam of my headlamp, I began the meticulous task of reassembly. It wasn't about putting the pieces back together for aesthetics. It was about understanding the architecture of the violence, the killer's intent. Each cut, each clean separation spoke volumes. The precision was unnerving, suggesting not just knowledge of human anatomy, but an almost artistic appreciation for it. No ragged edges, no fumbled attempts. This wasn't a frenzied attack. It was a deliberate, calculated act. I worked methodically, my gloved fingers tracing the smooth, almost polished surfaces of the bone fragments. The generator coughed once, then settled back into its rhythmic thrum. My breath plumed in the cold air. Piece by piece, the fragmented puzzle began to take a crude, unsettling form. The pelvis, the femur, the ribs. I focused on the shoulder girdle again, running my thumb over the distinctive remodeling. It wasn't just a healed fracture, it was a reinforced fracture. A titanium plate long since removed had once been secured there, leaving behind a faint, almost ghost-like imprint in the bone where the screws had been. This wasn't just any injury, it was a serious one, likely requiring extensive rehabilitation and the kind of surgery that would leave detailed records. That was it. That was the missing piece. This wasn't a mark by the killer, not directly. This was a detail about the victim, something unique enough to cut through the anonymity of the dismemberment. The killer had left it, or rather, had not obscured it, perhaps as a challenge. Damn the outage. I needed access to the National Missing Persons database, to medical records. My personal tablet, thankfully, had enough battery. I connected it to a portable hard drive where I kept a backup of some forensic databases and cross-referenced the unique surgical signature. It was a long shot, a needle in a haystack, but the specificity of the repair was my guide. Minutes stretched into an hour. My fingers flew across the screen, inputting parameters. Male, approximate age range based on bone density, severe shoulder trauma, surgical repair with specific hardware. The system word processing the request. The generator outside seemed to groan in protest. Then a hit. A single, almost impossibly perfect match. The screen glowed, illuminating a face. A young man, early 20s, with a kind smile and light eyes. Missing for 6 months, reported by his family. Name, Daniel Carter. The report detailed a severe snowboarding accident 2 years prior, resulting in a complex humeral fracture requiring extensive surgical reconstruction with a custom titanium plate. The details matched my findings precisely, right down to the specific make and model of the hardware, now absent from the remains. Daniel Carter wasn't just a missing person, he was now a victim, and the meticulous nature of his demise suggested he wasn't the first. The killer had removed the plate, another deliberate act, leaving only its ghost in the bone. My next step was to cross-reference Daniel Carter's disappearance with other unsolved missing persons cases, looking for any geographical or temporal patterns. The database, slow and cumbersome on my tablet, eventually yielded more results. 3 other individuals, all young men, all reported missing within the last 18 months, all from roughly the same extended metropolitan area, though none from the same immediate neighborhood. No obvious connections, no shared social circles, no prior relationships, just disappearances seemingly random. But now with Daniel I had a body with a story of meticulous violence. This wasn't just a single gruesome murder. This was a pattern. The lead detective returned just before dawn, coffee in hand, looking haggard, The power was still out. He took one look at my strained face, then at the tablet screen. "Seth, what have you got?" he asked, his voice rough. "I've identified the victim," I stated, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Daniel Carter, missing for 6 months, and I think he's connected to at least 3 other unsolved missing persons cases." He frowned, taking a sip of his coffee. "Connected? How? We've been over those files, Seth." "No links." "The method," I insisted, tapping the screen. "The precision of the dismemberment, the removal of specific identifying features, but the deliberate leaving of a unique, surgically reinforced fracture. It's a signature. And when you look at the other missing persons, the pattern isn't in their social lives, it's in the way they vanished. No struggle, no trace, just gone, and the time frames. They line up perfectly with what we're seeing here." He rubbed his temples, his skepticism palpable. "Seth, you've got one body meticulously processed, I'll give you that. That's a leap. We don't even know if this killer is the same as the one who abducted those others. You're building a castle in the air." "It's not a feeling," I retorted, my voice rising. "It's forensic analysis. The level of surgical skill, the precise removal of the titanium plate, the way the remains were scattered to maximize disorienting the investigation. This isn't random, it's calculated, and it matches the sudden, untraceable disappearances of these other young men." I pointed to the list on the screen. "They're not just missing, detective, they're victims, and this killer is escalating." He sighed, running a hand over his stubbled chin. "Escalating or not, we have to prove it. This is a lot to take to the precinct captain. They'll want more than a theory based on a healed injury and some vanishings." They was I projecting. They was the horror of this case making me see patterns where none existed. No, this wasn't a reach. This was the beginning of something far more sinister than anyone was prepared for. And I knew with a terrible certainty that this killer was playing a game and Daniel Carter was just the first piece on the board. No, this was real. The ghost of the plate in Daniel Carter's bone, the chilling precision of his end, it wasn't my imagination running wild. This wasn't a random act of savagery. This was a message, meticulously crafted, and I was going to read it. The transition from the sun-drenched, harrowing scene to the controlled, yet suddenly chaotic, environment of the medical examiner's office during a power outage was jarring. The outside world had been muted by the sheer scale of the wilderness, but here, the lack of light amplified every sound. The low, guttural thrum of the emergency generator vibrated through the concrete floor, a constant, unsettling pulse beneath our feet. Fluorescent lights, usually humming with sterile efficiency, were dead, replaced by the stark, directional beams of headlamps and battery-powered task lights. Shadows danced and stretched, distorting familiar equipment into monstrous shapes. The air, typically cool and filtered, felt heavy, charged with the smell of ozone from the generator, disinfectant, and the faint, metallic tang that always clung to the lab. "All right, people, let's keep it moving," I called out, my voice cutting through the generator's drone. My own headlamp cast a tight circle of yellow light on the stainless steel examination table where the first batch of fragments lay. These were the more robust pieces, the ones that could withstand immediate scrutiny. The smaller, more delicate shards were still being carefully cataloged and photographed in the adjacent room by a meticulous lab assistant whose lamp beam bobbed like a firefly. My focus narrowed to a section of tibia, clean-cut, almost surgically precise. I slid a magnified lens over the bone, the tiny striations catching the light. The technician, I addressed the specialist, hunched over a microscope beside me, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What are I seeing on the kerf marks?" He adjusted his microscope, the faint click whir of the focus knob audible even over the generator. "Consistent width, Seth. Extremely uniform. No wavering, no hesitation, and the striations. They're incredibly fine, like a razor but with the power of a saw." She leaned back, pushing her safety glasses up her nose. "It's not a standard bone saw, not one I recognize from any medical kit at least. Too clean for a typical reciprocating saw, too fine for a band saw. The kerf is narrow, almost hair-thin." I nodded, my internal gears grinding. So, not an amateur with a hacksaw, not even a professional with a standard issue, something specialized. My mind immediately went to custom tooling, or perhaps a modified industrial saw repurposed for this gruesome task. The killer possessed not just knowledge of anatomy but also an understanding of mechanics of materials. This was beyond the casual dismemberment of a rage killer. This was planned, executed with an almost obsessive attention to detail. And the edges? I asked, tracing the smooth, almost polished surface of the cut with a gloved finger. Any signs of sanding, filing? None that I can detect under magnification. The technician replied, her voice tinged with a professional awe that was both unsettling and validating. The cut itself is the final step. No post-processing. Whatever tool they used, it left virtually no burrs, no splintering. Wait, that doesn't add up moment hit me. Most power saws, even fine-toothed ones, leave some degree of micro-fracturing or rough edges on bone, especially dense cortical bone like the tibia. To achieve such a pristine cut, repeatedly, without any signs of subsequent finishing work, it suggested a tool of incredible sharpness, rigidity, and perhaps a very high RPM, or a completely different method I hadn't considered. Let's get some residue samples from the cut surfaces, I instructed the technician, and run them through the spectrometer. I want to know if there's anything foreign embedded in the bone matrix, anything that might indicate a lubricant, a cooling agent, even a specific metal alloy from the blade itself. Meanwhile, across the room, another colleague, the chemist, was hunched over a fume hood, its internal fan providing a quiet whir that momentarily drowned out the generator. His headlamp illuminated a series of beakers and test tubes, bubbling gently. "Seth," he called out, his voice slightly muffled by his mask. "I'm getting something unusual from the tissue samples, from the points of severance specifically." I made my way over, the beam of my headlamp sweeping across the dimly lit lab. "Unusual how?" "There's a faint but consistent residue," she explained, holding up a small vial with a pale, almost invisible liquid. "It's a complex organic compound, not a preservative we typically see like formaldehyde, and not a common disinfectant. It has properties of both a potent antimicrobial and a mild tissue fixative, but it's almost like it's designed to stabilize the tissue immediately after dismemberment, preventing rapid decay at the cut surface." My breath hitched. "To what end?" She shrugged, her eyes wide behind her safety glasses. "To preserve the integrity of the cut, perhaps, or to buy time. If I'm going to scatter remains, and I want them to retain certain characteristics for a specific period, this would be an incredibly effective and highly sophisticated way to do it. It's not something I'd find in a hardware store or even a standard medical supply cabinet." The killer wasn't just precise in their cuts, they were precise in their aftercare. They weren't just dismembering, they were curating, preserving the evidence of their artistry even as they scattered it. This wasn't just about destroying a body, it was about presenting a body fragmented but meticulously maintained. "So, a unique signature in the cutting and a unique signature in the chemical treatment," I murmured, staring at the vial in her hand. "This isn't just a killer. This is an artist, a scientist, and a planner all rolled into one." The words felt heavy, each one a stone in my gut. This wasn't me seeing patterns. This was the killer creating patterns, making them visible. "And it's potent," the chemist added, holding the vial to the light. "We're talking about concentrations that suggest a deliberate, widespread application at each severance point. Not just a spray, more like a bath or a thorough coating." My mind raced. A bath. That implied a container, a controlled environment, not just a quick treatment in the field. This killer wasn't working in the wilderness. They were transporting the body to a secondary, controlled location for the dismemberment and treatment, then returning to the wilderness for the scattering. The level of preparation, the logistical nightmare of such an operation was staggering. "Run a full spectrum analysis on that compound," I told her, the urgency in my voice undeniable. "Every single component. I want to know what it is, where it comes from, and who would have access to it." I returned to the tibia, the precise cut now seeming even more sinister under the harsh beam of my headlamp. The killer's unique signature was solidifying, a specialized, extremely sharp tool capable of surgical precision, coupled with an advanced chemical treatment to preserve their work. And the deeper I delved, the more I realized this wasn't just about finding a killer. It was about deciphering a language, one written in bone and blood and chemicals, meant only for me. This was a killer who didn't just understand anatomy, they revered it or perhaps twisted it into something grotesque. The tibia, with its unnervingly clean transection, felt less like evidence and more like a carefully presented trophy. My headlamp beam, cutting through the damp wilderness air, illuminated the faint, almost iridescent sheen on the bone surface, the chemical treatment. It was an advanced preservative, not just for delaying decomposition, but for maintaining the integrity of the cuts, the very artistry of the dismemberment. Hours blurred into a single, aching span. The wilderness had given up its secrets slowly, grudgingly, under the relentless sweep of our searchlights. By the time I finally returned to the medical examiner's office during a power outage, my muscles screamed, and the acrid smell of pine needles and damp earth clung to my clothes like a shroud. The office was a different beast in the dark. Emergency generators hummed somewhere in the basement, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floor. Fluorescent lights, usually a harsh, sterile glare, were replaced by the flickering amber glow of battery-powered lanterns and the focused beams of individual headlamps. Shadows stretched and danced, distorting familiar equipment into monstrous shapes. It lent an unsettling intimacy to the space, stripping away the clinical detachment I usually relied on. I set my gear down with a clatter that echoed too loudly in the sudden quiet. A colleague, their face illuminated from below by a small LED lantern, looked up from a microscope. "Anything new, Seth? It's beyond surgical, almost artistic, and the chemical treatment, it's not just to preserve, it's to showcase." I walked over to the main examination table where the initial collection of remains lay under a thin sheet. Even covered, I could feel their presence. "Showcase what?" the colleague asked, pushing their chair back. "Their skill, their depravity, their message," I corrected, pulling out my own portable light. The beam sliced through the gloom, focusing on a section of the table. "They want us to see it, to understand the care they put into this. It's not just a body, it's a canvas." I paused, running a hand over my stubbled chin. "And it's not the first." "We know that, Seth, the missing persons reports." "No, I mean it's not the first time this killer has done this. The signature, the technique, the specific chemical compound, it's solidifying into a pattern. This isn't a first-timer finding their footing. This is someone refined, someone who has done this before many times." A sigh escaped my colleague. "That's a grim thought for a Tuesday night, especially with the power out. Makes it feel like the world's gone quiet just for us." I ignored the comment, my mind already racing. The meticulousness, the sheer effort involved in dismembering a body with such precision, treating the bones and then scattering them over such a wide area. It spoke of an almost obsessive personality, a methodical mind, and that made them all the more dangerous. My attention was drawn to a small, unassuming brown paper package on the corner of my personal workstation. It hadn't been there when I left for the scene. It was roughly the size of a small book, tied with simple twine. No sender address, no postal marks. "Did anyone see who left this?" I inquired, my voice sharper than I intended. My colleague glanced over. "Oh, that. A courier dropped it off about an hour ago, said it was urgent, came through the back entrance, I guess, didn't stick around, I just put it on my desk." A courier during a power outage to the back entrance. No ID, no signature. Urgent. My internal alarm bells began to clang. This wasn't standard procedure. Nothing about this felt right. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the package. My colleague, sensing the shift in my demeanor, stopped what they were doing and watched me. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the hum of the generator suddenly louder, more ominous. I untied the twine, my fingers fumbling, and on its lid, carved with exquisite detail, was a human eye. Not just any eye, but one with an unnerving accuracy, a slight fleck in the iris that seemed familiar, too familiar. My breath hitched. I knew that eye. I'd seen it in countless self-portraits, in photographs from my student days. It was my eye. I pried open the lid. Inside, resting on more moss, was a single, perfectly preserved human finger bone, a distal phalanx specifically. It was tiny, delicate, almost childlike. But it wasn't the bone that made me freeze. It was the minuscule, almost invisible inscription etched onto its surface. I had to angle my headlamp just so, bringing the bone inches from my face. The inscription was a single word, carved with a precision that mirrored the dismemberment of the wilderness victim. It read, "Observed." The word hit me like a physical blow. Observed. Not just a message, a declaration. This wasn't a random serial killer. This wasn't just about their twisted art. This was about me. The killer knew my name, knew my appearance. What is it? What's in there? I couldn't answer immediately. My mind reeled, trying to process the implications. The meticulousness of the carving, the personal nature of the gift, the sheer audacity of it. I pushed the box away as if it might contaminate me. My colleague picked up their lantern, shining it over the contents. Their eyes widened as they saw the carved eye, then the bone, and finally the word. Observed. What? They're here. The killer wasn't just leaving clues, they were initiating a dialogue. A very personal, very terrifying dialogue. And I was now a player in their game. The game had just changed. The words still echoed in my skull. They're here, and they're watching me. I was staring into the darkened office, the air thick with the metallic tang of old blood and embalming fluid, when the world went black. Not a gradual dimming, not a flicker, but an abrupt, absolute plunge into nothingness. The hum of the ventilation system died. The fluorescent lights overhead, already casting a sickly pallor, blinked out. A collective gasp, then a muttered curse from the detective beside me. My own breath hitched. The sudden, profound silence, broken only by the rapid thrum of my own pulse in my ears, was more jarring than any scream. The power outage, of course. Anyone got a flashlight? I had one, a heavy-duty tactical beam, always in my coat pocket. My fingers closed around its cold metal casing. The building was truly dead. My beam landed on the fragmented note again, the single word, "Watcher," still pinned to the corkboard. In the stark, unforgiving light of my flashlight, it seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The killer wasn't just leaving clues, they were initiating a dialogue, and now they'd pulled the curtains on the stage. "No generators," the detective said, his voice tight. "This feels deliberate." I nodded, though they couldn't see it. The thought had already wormed its way into my mind. A power outage during a critical phase of the investigation, right after I'd articulated my gut feeling about being watched. Too coincidental for a killer who reveled in precision. "Maybe," I murmured, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. Or a very convenient accident for someone who doesn't want us seeing too much. My beam traced the outlines of the dismembered remains on the table. The macabre jigsaw puzzle that consumed my days and nights. The killer's surgical skill was undeniable, the cuts clean, the separations precise. It was the arrangement, though, that always got me, the deliberate artistry. And then I remembered something, a small detail I'd cataloged but hadn't fully processed in the harsh glare of the overhead lights. "The latest victim," I said, swinging my light back to the covered gurney. Before all this." I pulled back the sheet, illuminating the torso. "Look at the ligature marks on the wrists and ankles." The detective leaned in, his own smaller flashlight now active, casting a weaker, yellowish glow. "Standard binding, Seth, tight, deep." "No," I countered, my finger tracing the faint, almost imperceptible crisscross pattern within the deeper grooves. "Not standard, see this, it's not just rope. It's a specific kind of twine, braided, almost like a fishing line but much stronger, thinner. And the knots, they are incredibly complex. Not your average sailor's knot, more like something an artisan would use." The assistant, now holding a flickering battery-powered lantern, edged closer. "An artisan, someone who works with their hands with fine detail," I explained. Someone who understands tension, who makes things, or someone who dismantles things with the same meticulous care they might build them. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. The precision, the artistic arrangement, the complex ligatures. There was a report, the detective said slowly, his brow furrowed in the dim light. A missing person from a few months back, a former taxidermist, known for their incredibly detailed work apparently, had a workshop out near the old industrial district, supposedly had some eccentric tendencies, a real loner. My head snapped up. A taxidermist, someone who worked with anatomy, who understood how to separate flesh from bone to preserve and pose. The pieces clicked with an unnerving ease. The meticulous dismemberment, the artistic arrangement of the remains, even the unusual ligatures. A taxidermist might use such specialized bindings for their craft, for shaping and holding delicate forms. It fit. It fit almost too perfectly. Eccentric tendencies. I pressed. Anything specific? Neighbors reported strange smells, late-night activity. The detective continued, flipping through a mental file. Obsessive attention to detail, said they could bring things back to life with their craft, even had a few run-ins with animal rights groups for their more unconventional displays. The assistant gasped softly. A taxidermist, that would explain the precision, the way the body was treated, like a specimen. A plausible suspect. A clear, direct line of inquiry. The detective's eyes, usually heavy with exhaustion, now held a spark of renewed purpose. Get a unit out to that workshop, now, see if anyone's home. It was too neat. This killer, the one who left encrypted messages and taunted me with direct challenges, felt far more sophisticated than a reclusive taxidermist, even an eccentric one. The watcher note. It all felt like a carefully orchestrated performance. They was this new lead just another act in their macabre play, a distraction. Wait, I said, my voice cutting through the detective's hushed conversation. He looked at me, irritation etched on his face. The sheer volume of missing persons, the geographical spread. Does a single reclusive taxidermist truly fit that pattern? And the psychological component, the taunts, it feels like something more. Seth, we have a lead, the detective said, his voice strained with impatience. A strong lead, we have to pursue it. I understood the urgency. The pressure to deliver answers was immense. But the killer had shown a profound understanding of human nature, of psychology. Would someone so intelligent, so meticulous in their depravity, leave such an obvious breadcrumb? My flashlight beam, still steady, illuminated the victim's face, or what remained of it. The vacant stare seemed to mock me. This taxidermist, if they were the killer, was a plausible monster. But the killer I was chasing, the one who had invaded my thoughts and my office, felt like something else entirely. More complex, more insidious. Yes, pursue it, I conceded, my voice flat, but keep an open mind. This feels like a red herring, a very deliberate, very twisted red herring. The detective just nodded, already giving instructions into his phone, his focus now entirely on the tangible lead. He wanted a name, a face, a place to pin the blame. I couldn't fault him for it. The killer wasn't just watching me. They were guiding my hand, leading me down a path of their own choosing. The distant wail of sirens, once a comforting sound of impending order, now just seemed to amplify the unsettling silence of the medical examiner's office during a power outage. Generators had kicked in, grumbling to life with a mechanical cough, casting the hallways in a sickly, flickering yellow. The air grew heavy with the smell of diesel and the metallic tang that always seemed to cling to these places, even in the best of times. I found myself hunched over a light table in one of the smaller analysis rooms, the magnified images of bone fragments glowing eerily beneath the emergency lamps. The detective stood across from me, a silhouette against the intermittent hum, his face a mask of grim determination. "Anything, Seth?" he questioned, his voice rough around the edges, strained by the day's frustrations. The tangible lead he'd been so keen on from the previous scene had evaporated like morning mist, a dead-end street in a city of shadows. The supposed witness had a rock-solid alibi, leaving us back at square one, or rather, still mired in the same intricate, disturbing pattern. I pushed a magnified image of a sternum fragment closer to his view. Look at the striations here, detective. Microscopic, almost artistic, not a hack job. This wasn't just about dismemberment, it was about presentation. Every cut, every separation precise. A surgeon's hand or someone with an obsessive understanding of human anatomy. My finger traced the almost invisible lines. The killer isn't just disposing of bodies, they're telling a story, and I don't like the narrative. He leaned in, his brow furrowed. A story that started with a body in the wilderness and now includes. What exactly? They're not random. There's a demographic consistency, an age range, a certain disconnect from immediate family. People who wouldn't be missed immediately but would eventually become a statistic. A sudden sharp ring cut through the generator's drone. It was the detective's burner phone, a device he used only for sensitive, off-book communication. He snatched it, his expression tightening further as he listened, offering only clipped, terse responses. When? Where? Is he okay? Stay there, don't touch anything. He snapped the phone shut, the sound echoing in the confined space. The evidence technician. Someone broke into his apartment an hour ago. Nothing stolen, not a thing out of place except for one item. My stomach clenched. What item? A package left on his kitchen counter, wrapped in butcher paper tied with twine. The detective paused, swallowing hard. Inside, he found a bone, human. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, pressing in on me. What kind of bone? He didn't get close enough to identify it beyond that. Just said it was clean, polished almost. This was it, the escalation, the direct communication. Yeah, a single line. He read it to me word for word. It said, "Still missing a piece of the puzzle, Professor." The words hit me like a physical blow. Professor. A title few used, a reference to my academic past, a detail not widely publicized in the current investigation. This wasn't just a random act, it was personal. The bone had a tiny, almost invisible fissure, near the distal end. He remembered I pointing out something similar on one of the first victims. My breath caught in my throat. The first victim, the one found in the wilderness. There was a unique fracture on the left distal phalanx of the ring finger, a hairline crack I'd attributed to a specific type of trauma, a detail so minute, so obscure, I'd almost overlooked it myself during the initial examination. It was a detail I'd only discussed with the immediate forensic team, with my team. How could the killer have known about that? More importantly, how could the killer have that specific bone? It had been meticulously processed, cataloged, and stored in the secure evidence locker at this very office. That's impossible, I replied, my voice hoarse. That bone, it's in evidence. It was part of the first victim's remains. I identified that fracture myself. It's unique. The detective just stared at me, his eyes mirroring my own sudden horror. I know, Seth, I know, which means one of two things. Either our killer has breached the most secure evidence facility in the state, or they never gave us all the pieces to begin with. The second option was far more terrifying. It suggested the killer had held back a piece of the puzzle, waiting for the opportune moment to introduce it, to taunt me directly, to demonstrate their intimate knowledge of my process, my observations. It meant they were not just a step ahead, but playing an entirely different game, with rules I hadn't even begun to comprehend. A sudden wave of nausea washed over me. I gripped the edge of the light table, the images of the fragmented sternum blurring before my eyes. This wasn't just about catching a killer anymore. It was about surviving a psychological assault, a direct challenge thrown into my face. The killer was inside my head, using my own insights against me. "We need to get to the technician's apartment," I answered, pushing away from the table, the generator's hum now a mocking drone in my ears. "Now, before anything else happens." The detective nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I've got a unit en route, but this changes everything, doesn't it?" It did. It changed everything. The game wasn't just escalating. It was twisting, turning inward, threatening to consume not just the victims, but the very people trying to bring justice. Was I truly seeing the pattern? Or was the killer merely guiding my gaze, making me believe I was uncovering truths while simply leading me further down a meticulously crafted rabbit hole? Or was I just projecting patterns onto the chaos, desperate for an answer that wasn't there? The thought had been a sliver of ice under my skin, chilling my certainty. Then the lights died. Not a flicker, not a groan, just a sudden, absolute plunge into an inky blackness that swallowed the fluorescent hum and the gentle whir of the ventilation system. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant wail of a siren, instantly muted by the thick walls of the building. I instinctively reached out, my hand brushing against the cool, smooth steel of the examination table. My heart gave a startled thump against my ribs, but it wasn't fear. It was an adrenaline surge, the kind that sharpens the senses. A moment later, the emergency lights kicked in, bathing the medical examiner's office during a power outage in a sickly, amber glow. Equipment became hulking silhouettes, tools glinted ominously, and the partially reconstructed skeletal remains laid out on the table before me seemed to leer from the gloom. I'd been hunched over a microscope, scrutinizing a sliver of bone from the latest victim, a fragment of a femur, meticulously stripped clean, yet still holding secrets I couldn't unlock. The previous chapter of this grim story had ended with a taunt, a personalized message, and the realization that the killer wasn't just playing a game. They were twisting it, turning it inward. My own resolve felt frayed, picked at by doubt. Just what I needed, I muttered to the empty room, my voice sounding rough in the sudden quiet. The power outage had effectively halted any further microscopic analysis, cutting off the advanced imaging software that had been my crutch. It was frustrating, yet also strangely liberating. It stripped away the reliance on high-tech solutions, forcing me back to basics. I pushed away from the microscope, its eyepiece now a blind, useless eye. My gaze swept over the table, over the bone fragments arranged in what I'd come to understand was a deliberate, almost artistic pattern. The dismemberment was precise, surgical, yet the placement of the remains in the wilderness had been theatrical. It was this dichotomy that gnawed at me. The killer was clearly highly skilled, knowledgeable in anatomy, but also possessed a perverse aesthetic. My eyes landed on a small, plastic evidence bag I'd set aside earlier. It contained a handful of the smaller bone fragments, mostly phalanges and carpals from the first victim. I'd run them through the basic scans, found nothing remarkable beyond the expected trauma. I picked up the bag, tilting it under the emergency lamp. The tiny bones within seemed to shimmer faintly, catching the dim light. I pulled out a small, battery-operated magnifier from my kit, a relic from my early days, and held one of the carpal bones close. It was perhaps a centimeter long, smooth and ivory, but under the magnifier I saw it. It wasn't on the surface. It was embedded. A microscopic speck, no bigger than a grain of sand, nestled deep within a hairline fracture on the bone's surface, almost as if it had been driven there. In the bright, even light of the main lab, the automatic filters of the digital microscope might have dismissed it as background noise, an artifact. But here, in the stark, raw light of the emergency lamp, magnified by a simple lens, it stood out. It had a peculiar metallic sheen, a deep, almost iridescent blue. I carefully extracted the fragment using fine tweezers, placing it on a clean slide. My hands were steady, a sudden calm descending as my mind raced. This wasn't biological. It wasn't organic. It was foreign, inorganic, and its placement suggested it wasn't casual contamination. I remembered the killer's precision, their meticulousness. They didn't leave careless mistakes. This wasn't a mistake. This was a clue, either intentional or unavoidable. Using the magnifier, I studied the speck. It wasn't metal, not in the traditional sense. It had a crystalline structure, reflecting light with an almost unnatural brilliance. My mind began to sift through possibilities, industrial abrasives, specialized cutting tools, something used in a very specific manufacturing process. The color was distinctive, a deep, almost electric blue. I recalled the psychological profile we'd built: a meticulous planner, someone with an appreciation for detail, perhaps even a fetish for precision. This wasn't just someone who knew anatomy. This was someone who operated in an environment where such a material might be common, or who used tools that contained it. The surgical precision wasn't just about the cuts, it was about the overall execution. Could this be from the very instrument used for the dismemberment, or from the environment where the act took place? The thought sent a fresh jolt through me. If it was from the environment, it pointed to a specific location, perhaps a workshop, an abandoned factory, a clandestine space where such materials were handled. If it was from the tools, it pointed to a specific, highly specialized implement. This wasn't me projecting patterns. This microscopic blue speck was a blueprint, a hidden key to the killer's world, embedded in the very bones of their victim. It was a link between the grotesque artistry and a tangible physical reality. The game wasn't just twisting, it was revealing its true, terrifying face. The killer wasn't just a ghost in the wilderness. They were a craftsman and they left their mark. And now I had a piece of it. A very small, very blue, very significant piece. The power outage had taken away my sight, only to grant me true vision. The lights died. Not a flicker, not a groan, just a sudden absolute plunge into an inky blackness that swallowed the fluorescence, the screens, the very air itself. My eyes, accustomed to the harsh glow of the medical examiner's office, felt suddenly seared, then blinded. A low, collective murmur rippled through the room, quickly hushed by the sheer, encompassing vacuum of sound. The hum of the ventilation system vanished, replaced by an unnerving silence that pressed in, thick and cold. I froze, one hand still hovering over the magnified image of the clavicle, its intricate saw marks now lost to the void. The universe, it seemed, was mocking my desperate search for order by plunging me into the ultimate disarray. My own hand fumbled for my tactical flashlight, a habit ingrained from years of working in less than ideal field conditions. It illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, the corner of a stainless steel table, and the anxious face of the detective who had been leaning over my shoulder moments before. "Just a power surge," the detective said, his voice a low rumble though his eyes darted around, betraying a flicker of unease. "Happens sometimes in these older buildings." I didn't buy it, not after everything. Not after the taunts, the calculated precision, the way this killer seemed to anticipate every move. A simple power surge felt too convenient, too pedestrian. There was this another message. Another disruption designed to throw us off balance. I forced the thought down. "Focus, Seth. Just focus." I swept the beam back to the workstation, its screens now blank, inert. The clavicle, the piece of bone that had held my attention, lay on its sterile drape. I leaned in, my flashlight beam a tight circle, illuminating the precise, almost artistic beveling along the edge of the bone cut. It wasn't just a simple dismemberment, it was a deliberate shaping. "The generator should kick in soon," the detective muttered, pulling out his own phone, its screen a smaller, weaker rectangle of light. I ignored him, my focus absolute. The power outage had stripped away the distractions, leaving only the bone and my scrutinizing gaze. I remembered a faint, almost imperceptible striation pattern on the cut surface, visible only under extreme magnification. Before the lights died, I'd been dismissing it as artifact, a minor variation in the saw blade. But now, in this stark, focused light, it seemed to scream for attention. I pulled a small, powerful jeweler's loop from my kit, securing it to my glasses. The tiny lens brought the bone's edge into razor-sharp relief. The striations weren't random. They weren't from a standard bone saw, not even a high-precision surgical one. They were too shallow, too evenly spaced, almost like a micro-serration, but one that seemed to polish as it cut rather than just tear. And then I saw it. A minuscule, almost microscopic, crescent-shaped indentation repeated at regular intervals along the cut. It wasn't a flaw. It was a signature. A distinct, repeating pattern that spoke of a very specific tool, used with an almost ritualistic consistency. My mind raced, flipping through decades of anatomical texts, forensic journals, obscure historical documents. This wasn't a modern surgical technique. This wasn't even a standard carpenter's saw. It was something far older, far more specialized. The beveling, the polishing effect, the crescent marks. Bone articulation. The words flashed into my mind with the force of a physical blow. Not surgery, not butchery, but the meticulous, almost reverent process of preparing and joining skeletal remains for display or study. A technique that required not just knowledge of anatomy, but an understanding of bone structure, density, and how to create seamless, almost invisible joints. A skill that was more art than science, perfected by a select few, often in the service of museums, universities, or even private collections of anatomical curiosities. The cuts aren't just clean. I heard myself say the words a low hum in the quiet office. There, prepared, like for articulation, to be reassembled almost. The detective frowned, his phone light illuminating the confusion on his face. Reassembled. Seth, we're talking about a dismembered body scattered across miles of wilderness. Exactly, I countered, my voice gaining strength, the earlier self-doubt receding like the tide. It doesn't make sense. Why dismember with such precision, such care if the intent is just to scatter, unless the scattering is part of the message and the preparation is for something else entirely? The weight that doesn't add up moment hit me with full force. The contradiction was glaring. Extreme care in dismemberment, almost artistic, yet followed by brutal, random scattering. It was a paradox, a deliberate misdirection. The killer wasn't just dismembering, they were preparing the remains for something, and then deliberately denying that purpose by scattering them. It was a mockery, a desecration of their own twisted artistry. The tool, I continued, pointing my flashlight at the microscopic crescents, it's not a standard saw. It's a very fine, specialized instrument. A type of bone file or perhaps a custom-made oscillating saw designed for precise, low-impact cuts, meant to preserve the bone structure rather than destroy it. The kind of tool a professional articulator or a highly skilled taxidermist working with skeletal remains would use. The detective's eyes widened, a flicker of understanding replacing the confusion. I rest saying our killer is a bone artist, someone who builds skeletons, or someone trained in it, I corrected, the determination hardening in my chest. Someone with an intimate, almost obsessive knowledge of skeletal anatomy and the tools and skills to manipulate it. This isn't just about knowing where the joints are, it's about knowing how to make them disappear, how to make the bones flow seamlessly. It's a very niche, almost archaic skill set. Just then, with a low groan and a shudder that vibrated through the floor, the emergency generator kicked in. The detective straightened, pulling his phone away from his ear, where he'd been speaking in hushed tones. I've got a team on it. We're running a cross-reference on known bone articulators, museum preparators, even forensic sculptors with advanced anatomical training. Anyone with access to specialized tools or a history of working with human remains for academic or artistic purposes. This was it. The net was beginning to close. The abstract patterns were solidifying into a tangible lead. The killer wasn't just a monster. They were a monster with a very specific, highly specialized skill. This kind of skill is rare, and someone this meticulous, this deliberate. They won't leave a simple trail. The detective nodded, his jaw set. No, but now we know what kind of trail to look for. We'll start with university anatomy departments, natural history museums, even private collectors. Anyone who's ever taught, learned, or practiced advanced bone articulation. Every missing person, every unsolved case with a similar anatomical signature is being reevaluated. We're going back through everything. The hunt had begun. The air in the medical examiner's office during a power outage was a suffocating blanket, thick with the metallic tang of old blood and the sterile bite of cleaning agents. But tonight, those familiar smells were overshadowed by something else, a cold, cloying scent, like damp earth and something vaguely chemical, clinging to the sudden, oppressive darkness. My flashlight beam, a pathetic yellow finger, danced across the stainless steel tables, the shrouded gurneys, and the silent, imposing refrigerated units, each glint of reflected light amplifying the utter void around me. I'd been lured here, no doubt. The final taunt, delivered not through a package or a coded message, but a subtle shift in the pattern, a detail so minuscule it screamed of deliberate intent. A specific incision mark on the last fragment, a deviation from the previous meticulous work, pointing not to a new victim but a specific location. Here. My gut had screamed it, and against all better judgment I'd come, alone. My breath hitched in my throat, a ragged sound that felt impossibly loud. I gripped the heavy flashlight tighter, its cold metal a small comfort against the prickle of dread on my skin. Seth. A voice echoed, not from any discernible direction, but seeming to emanate from the very fabric of the room. It was low, calm, almost conversational, yet it scraped against my nerves like bone on pavement. I always were predictable, so much passion, so little true understanding. My beam snapped towards the sound, catching nothing but the empty space between two dissecting tables. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat. Show myself, I cowered, I managed, my voice rougher than I intended. The bravado felt thin, a desperate shield. A soft chuckle, devoid of humor, floated back. Coward. I am the architect, Seth, the sculptor of truth, and I. It was the security guard, or rather the former security guard, slumped against a cabinet, eyes wide and unseeing. And standing over him, almost blending into the gloom, was the stranger. The man who had once been a colleague, whose quiet demeanor I had foolishly dismissed as innocuous. The orchestrator. He stepped forward, just enough for my flashlight to catch the glint of his spectacles, sharp line of his jaw. He held something in his hand, a glinting scalpel, its edge catching the weak light. The precision, the anatomical knowledge, the twisted philosophy, it all clicked into place, a horrifying, elegant solution to the puzzle. He'd been right under our noses, observing, learning, planning. Of course it was me, he replied, his voice still calm, almost serene. Who else could appreciate the true artistry of the human form, the intricate dance of muscle, sinew, and bone? Most see only flesh, Seth. I see the blueprint, the potential for ultimate expression. He gestured vaguely with the scalpel towards the shrouded forms on the gurneys, a macabre conductor addressing his orchestra. They were merely canvases, incomplete, imperfect. I simply helped them achieve their final, most profound state, a testament to the fragility of life, then played games with us. Games, he scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound. I was offering you insight, Seth, a glimpse behind the veil. The human body in its natural state is a crude instrument, but broken down, reassembled. That is where its true purpose is revealed. A new order, a new understanding of existence. He took another step, the scalpel gleaming, my grip on the flashlight tight and my grip tight. This wasn't just about catching a killer anymore, it was about survival and understanding. The patterns, I pressed, trying to buy time, to understand the depths of his madness. The arrangements, they were messages for me. Indeed, a dialogue. I knew you would see it, Seth. You with your discerning eye, your morbid curiosity. You are the only one who truly sees what I do. The others, they merely catalog the damage. You appreciate the design. His words burrowed under my skin, twisted compliments that felt like accusations. He saw me, truly saw me, and it terrified me. He was right about my fascination, my pull towards the macabre, but he had perverted it, twisted it into something grotesque. You're sick, I spat. He tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. Perhaps, or perhaps I am simply enlightened. What is sickness, Seth, but a deviation from the norm? And what is the norm but a collective delusion? He advanced, slowly, deliberately. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken threats. My only chance was to fight, to use the environment, to use his twisted philosophy against him. The last victim, I responded, trying a different tack. The specific incision, it was different, a mistake. He paused, a flicker of something, perhaps annoyance, crossing his face. A nuance, a signature. You see, even in perfection there is room for evolution, but you noticed. Excellent. No, I countered, a sudden thought sparking a wait that doesn't add up moment. It wasn't a nuance. It was a lapse, a sign of haste, of sloppiness. You're losing control. His calm facade cracked. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Losing control. I am control. I dictated every cut, every placement. Every single fiber of their being was meticulously repurposed. Then why the rush? I pressed, sensing a weakness. Why the sudden change in method? You were under pressure. Someone else was getting close. You were afraid. His eyes, behind the spectacles, narrowed. I interpret my genius through the lens of my own limited understanding. He lunged then, a blur of motion in the dim light. The scalpel flashed, a silver streak aimed at my chest. I reacted instinctively, raising the flashlight, not as a weapon but as a shield. The impact sent a shockwave up my arm, but I held my ground. And in that moment, as I stared into his utterly unhinged eyes, I felt a flicker of doubt. Had I truly understood any of this? Or was I just another player in his macabre, meticulously crafted game? The hunt had led me here to this impossible confrontation, and now I wasn't so sure I was the hunter anymore. I might just be the next canvas. The metal clanged, a jarring noise that echoed in the silence of the medical examiner's office during a power outage, and the scalpel deflected, scraping harmlessly against the heavy-duty plastic of my flashlight. For a split second, the world narrowed to the glint of steel and the sudden, raw surprise in the attacker's eyes, illuminated by the meager beam. He hadn't expected the resistance. Neither had I, not truly. My arm jolted, the impact sending a tremor up to my shoulder, but my grip on the flashlight held. Then he was gone, not with a shout or a struggle, but with a silent, practiced retreat. I felt a gust of air as he spun, a phantom brush against my arm as he slipped past. My flashlight beam, still fixed on where he'd been, now cut through empty space. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice hoarse, adrenaline spiking through my veins like a jolt of lightning. I lunged forward, stumbling over something unseen, a chair, a discarded box, the flashlight beam swinging wildly. The room was a labyrinth of shadows and familiar equipment rendered monstrous by the lack of light. Not a slam, just a firm click, deliberate and unnervingly quiet. My breath hitched. He hadn't just attacked me, he'd escaped, and in my own domain no less. "Seth, what the hell was that?" It was the detective, his voice tight with alarm, followed by the clatter of feet in the hallway. A second, weaker beam of light danced into the room, then a third. A colleague. I recognized the gait. He was here. The detective was beside me in an instant, his flashlight a more powerful, focused beam, or perhaps it was only my imagination, heightened by the near miss. Who was here? What happened? The detective pressed, his hand gripping my arm, his voice losing its initial panic and hardening into professional urgency. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head, still reeling. "No, I deflected it. He had a scalpel. He went that way." I pointed vaguely towards the door I'd heard click shut. "He was in here in the main lab. I heard a noise, came to check. Power's still out." The colleague, a quiet, methodical person, moved swiftly to the door I indicated. Locked from the outside now, they reported, trying the handle. No sign of forced entry. He must have slipped out the main entrance, or he knows the building. The implication hung heavy in the air. This wasn't a random break-in. This was targeted, personal. My knees felt suddenly weak. My hands trembled, the flashlight beam in my grasp wavering slightly. I looked down at my chest where the scalpel had been aimed. The heavy fabric of my work coat, the thick plastic of the flashlight, they were the only things that had stood between me and a very different outcome. "Did you see him clearly?" the detective asked, his light sweeping over the room, searching for clues, for anything. Not clearly enough," I admitted, frustration burning. "Just a shape. Tall, lean, he moved fast, too fast. He was reaching for something on the central table when I came in." My eyes darted to the table, now illuminated by the combined flashlights. The table was exactly as I'd left it hours ago, covered with a sheet, the remains of the last victim still beneath it, waiting for further analysis. Except, not exactly. I stepped closer, my beam steadying. The sheet was ruffled, pulled back slightly from one corner, and on the stainless steel surface, directly beside where the victim's head would have been, lay a single object. It was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, no bigger than my thumb. Its wings were spread as if in flight, and its tiny eyes, though unpainted, seemed to bore into me. It was a common finch, perhaps. I reached for it, then stopped myself, remembering procedure. "Don't touch it," I warned, my voice still a little shaky. It's a calling card. Everything seemed to be in place. This wasn't just a taunt, it was a personal visit. He knew where I worked, knew my routine, knew I'd be here. And he had come into my space, walked right up to the very evidence I was dissecting, and left his mark. It was a profound violation. "Why a bird?" the colleague mused. "Does it mean anything to I, Seth?" I picked up a pair of sterile forceps from a nearby tray and carefully nudged the bird. It was lightweight, smooth, meticulously crafted. "I don't know," I admitted. "Not yet, but he's playing a game, and this feels like a move." My mind raced. He was bold, incredibly so. To infiltrate the medical examiner's office during a power outage, no less, was a calculated risk, but for what? To leave a tiny wooden bird. It felt like too much effort for such a seemingly benign object. "He didn't try to kill me," I stated, the words surprising even myself. If he wanted me dead, he had the chance. He had the element of surprise. He was close enough. The detective looked at me, a question in his eyes. "I think it was a warning then, or a demonstration," I countered, my thoughts spiraling. A show of how easily he could have. He was just proving a point, that he can get to me whenever he wants, wherever I am. It made me feel exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't before. I'd always prided myself on my analytical distance, my ability to remain objective. But this killer was dismantling that piece by piece. He was making it personal, turning my professional space into a hunting ground. I knelt, shining my flashlight beam across the floor, searching for anything else. A stray fiber, a footprint, anything that wasn't supposed to be there. The floor was spotless as always, but my eye caught a faint, almost invisible scuff mark near the entrance to the main lab. It wasn't a print, just a slight discoloration, as if something had been dragged or scraped. "Look here." I pointed it out to the others. Wasn't entirely silent. The detective leaned in. "What do you make of it?" "Too faint for a definitive print," I added, frustrated. "But it's fresh, and it's not going out the door, it's coming in." That was the wait that doesn't add up moment. If he'd come in through the main entrance silently, why was there a scuff mark leading into the room from the hallway, not out? Unless he hadn't just entered the building. Unless he had been inside already, waiting, or perhaps he had come in another way entirely, and this mark was from him preparing to enter this specific room. The thought made my stomach clench. He hadn't just broken in, he had infiltrated. And I want that bird carefully packaged. He wants me to understand something. What if I was wrong? What if the bird wasn't a message, but a misdirection? What if his true objective was something I hadn't even considered, something he had taken or tampered with, that I simply hadn't noticed yet in the chaos? He was a master of misdirection, after all. The air in the medical examiner's office during a power outage hummed with an unfamiliar quiet. The emergency lights, usually a pale, clinical white, cast an eerie, jaundiced glow on everything, stretching shadows long and distorted across the tiled floor. Rain lashed against the reinforced windows, a relentless drumming that somehow amplified the silence within. My fingers, usually so precise, traced the outline of a printed photograph, a familiar face, now forever marked by the killer's twisted signature. It was over. That much was certain. The detective had called me a week ago, his voice tight with a relief I could almost taste through the phone line. A botched disposal, a moment of hubris, and the stranger had finally been cornered in an abandoned factory on the city's industrial fringe. The pursuit had been brief, brutal, ending with him cornered, not by the tactical team, but by a collapsing section of the derelict structure he'd chosen as his final stand. Iron girders, rusted and unstable, had given way under his weight, leaving him trapped, not dead, but broken. Broken enough to be apprehended. And then the search of his hidden space. That's when the last piece clicked into place, the piece that had kept me up at night, festering with doubt. The bird. I had fixated on the bird, its careful placement, its symbolic weight. It wasn't the bird. It was the absence. Among his macabre collection, a trove of personal effects and anatomical trophies, they found it. Not a large bone, not a prominent organ. Just a small, almost insignificant carpal bone, a lunate from the left wrist of the first victim, carefully polished, meticulously preserved. It was the only bone missing from her remains, the one piece that hadn't been scattered. He hadn't just dismembered, he had curated. He had taken a piece, not as a taunt to me, but as a personal trophy, a secret he held close, knowing it would be overlooked by anyone focused on the grand, gruesome tableau. The bird had been a misdirection, a grand flourish to distract from the quiet, intimate theft of that single, unremarkable bone. The arraignment had been swift, almost anticlimactic given the sheer horror of the crimes. He sat there across the courtroom, a figure stripped of his carefully constructed mystique. No longer the ghost in the wilderness, the phantom surgeon. Just a man, pale and gaunt, his eyes holding a disturbing lack of remorse as the litany of his atrocities was read aloud. I'd watched him trying to find a flicker of humanity, a shadow of an explanation in his gaze. There was nothing, just an unsettling emptiness like looking into a deep, lightless well. My testimony had been clinical, dispassionate, laying out the bone evidence, the meticulous cuts, the precise measurements that spoke of his surgical precision. That was the only way to pin him down, to ensure justice. I had doubted myself, questioned my judgment, felt the icy grip of his taunts. The sheer audacity of his methods, the twisted artistry, it had threatened to consume me. To understand him, even clinically, felt like inviting a shard of his madness into my own mind. But I hadn't broken. I had pushed through the revulsion, through the fear, through the self-doubt. I had looked at the horror, faced it head-on, and found a way to translate its macabre language into the irrefutable truth. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about giving a voice to the voiceless, about bringing a measure of closure to those left behind, about ensuring that such calculated cruelty did not go unpunished. The power flickered once, then held steady, the emergency lights momentarily dimming before regaining their sickly glow. I closed the file, the sound echoing in the quiet office. The legal process would grind on, appeals would be filed, but the core truth was immutable. He was caught. He was contained, and I had played my part. The rain continued its mournful drumming, a fitting soundtrack to an uneasy peace. The rain had stopped days ago, then weeks. The power, restored within hours, brought back the harsh, familiar hum of the fluorescent lights, chasing away the jaundiced glow of the emergency lamps. But something in the air of the medical examiner's office, for me, never quite cleared. It was like a scent that clung to the ventilation system, a ghost of ozone and fear. Months had passed since the final, chilling confrontation. The details of the killer's capture were a blur of adrenaline and grim satisfaction, a necessary end to a macabre symphony. The perpetrator, a quiet, unassuming individual with an artist's hands and a butcher's heart, was now safely behind bars, their twisted masterpieces confined to the annals of criminal history. The relief, when it finally settled, wasn't the joyous burst I might have imagined. It was a slow, seeping quiet like water filling a cracked vessel. I found myself back in my lab, the familiar smell of reagents and sterile surfaces a strange comfort. A new case lay before me, a relatively straightforward identification of skeletal remains found by a hiker, nothing like the calculated artistry of the previous one. A simple bullet wound, a shallow grave. Routine. Yet my hands moved differently. My eyes lingered longer on the bone striations, searching not just for facts but for echoes. I picked up a femur, turning it over in my gloved hands. The clean break on this one was accidental, post-mortem, but I kept seeing the surgical precision of his work, the deliberate, almost loving cuts that had separated bone from muscle, joint from joint. It was a ghost limb and phantom ache that resided just behind my own joints, a constant reminder of how easily the human form could be undone. "Seth, you in there?" The lead detective's voice boomed from the doorway, startling me. He leaned against the frame, a steaming mug cradled in his hands. Got a minute? I nodded, setting the femur down with deliberate care. Always. He stepped inside, the usual scent of stale coffee and worn leather preceding him. He didn't come in often unless it was for a new case or a final wrap-up. This felt like neither. He just stood there watching me. "You've been quiet," he observed, not unkindly. "More than usual even for you." I shrugged, a gesture that felt inadequate, just processing. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "They're talking about putting you forward for a commendation, for the forensic brilliance that cracked the case." He paused, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "And for not losing your head when he started playing his games." A commendation. The thought felt hollow. My head had been lost many times over. I was the one who understood the language. That was the lingering scar, the one that truly bothered me. Not just the horror of what I'd seen, but the unsettling intimacy of it. The killer had spoken to me through his victims, through his taunts, and I, in turn, had understood. I had deciphered his twisted grammar, his macabre syntax. It was a connection I wished I could sever, a thread that still pulled at some hidden corner of my mind. "The language of broken things," I murmured, more to myself than to him. He finished his coffee, then set the mug on a nearby counter. "I did good, Seth. I saved others." I knew that. Intellectually, I knew the outcome was a triumph. The string of missing persons had stopped. The families had some semblance of closure, even if it was the grim closure of recovery, but the cost felt personal. Later that week, I found myself walking through the city park, the crisp autumn air a welcome change from the sterile confines of the lab. Leaves crunched underfoot, a symphony of decay and renewal. A child laughed, chasing a dog. Normalcy, vibrant and insistent. But even here, the scar made itself known. I saw the way people moved, the subtle mechanics of their gait, the way their joints flexed. I saw the fragile architecture beneath their skin, the vulnerable points. It wasn't a conscious effort, but an involuntary lens through which I now viewed the world. The human form, once a marvel of resilience, now seemed exquisitely delicate, a collection of precisely arranged parts, terrifyingly easy to disassemble. I thought of the killer's meticulous notes, recovered from a hidden compartment in his workshop. He hadn't just dismembered bodies, he had deconstructed them, reducing them to their fundamental elements, as if searching for some ultimate truth in the fragments. And I, in my own way, had done the same, albeit with a different purpose. The tension hadn't gone. It had merely shifted from an external threat to an internal hum, a constant awareness. I stopped by a small, tranquil pond, watching a duck glide across the surface. The water was still, reflecting the bare branches of the trees. It looked calm, peaceful. But beneath the surface, unseen, were currents, unseen life, unseen depths, just like everything else. My work, I realized, was to keep diving into those depths, even when the lingering scar made me want to turn away. Because someone had to, and I, forever changed, was still the one for the job.